So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to the Innovative Finance for Urban Fresh Food Markets, Resilient Cities and Healthy Diets. So we're looking at all different types of markets, wholesale, retail, hybrid, in the urban space. And I'm joined today by our co-hosts who are GAIN, I'm from GAIN, ICLEI Africa, the World Bank, World Union of Wholesale Markets and FAO. We have decided to keep the introduction short and spend more time on a joint presentation so that we can actually get into a coherent substance of financing markets. I'm Dr. Anne Trevennan-Jones. I'm from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. On the right is one of the markets that we rehabilitated actually during COVID in Dar es Salaam. It is the second biggest market there, so a sense of the mix of formality and informality in our systems that we're trying to finance. We will move on to, as I said, a mixed keynote speech where all of us will speak. Unfortunately, our FAO colleagues will not be here today, but Luke from ICLEI Africa will speak through their slides as well. We will then have a panel with the Voice of Cities and a partner, and then we'd like some really interactive audience engagement. So we're here also to learn and get to either learn how you are doing something successfully in the financing space or some of the challenges you have or barriers. What do you need to know? What pathway blockages are there? And how can we move things along? And then we'll have a closing and thank you. And just on the right-hand side is a market in Jinja, Uganda, where I was last year. And you can actually see that investment in markets is not just about the hard infrastructure, but also about the soft infrastructure. That's not just about the training, the skills, the regulations, guidelines, like the Codex guidelines for hygiene, for traditional markets for food, but also about committees, governance, who does what, who can do what. It shouldn't always be the role of city governments to do everything in the markets. Our keynote speakers, I've introduced myself. Every keynote speaker will introduce themselves as they go through the slides, but in brief, Dr. Luc Metlekamp, he's the head of the African City Food Center from ICLEI Africa. The FAO representative would have been our colleague Anna Puha Cruzet. She is the urban food system specialist. And then Usa Geertz, she is a senior agricultural economist from the World Bank. So without further ado, straight on to the keynote speech from all of us. So setting the frame for GAIN, obviously we enter markets through the lens of nutrition, but we see nutrition systemically. It is all about biodiverse food is bionutrient access. Climate smart food is access to good food. Markets are this concentrated space in the urban environment where vendors and consumers are meeting daily. They're having conversations, they're trading, they're asking about what they should do when the next produce is available and more. In fact, often giving each other credit. So it is a place where food is practiced. It's more than sustenance. It's not enough to have enough food, but is it nourishing food? It is also about culture and community. And I mention these things because often in a city government, we find the markets under the economy or trade department. So seen very much as an economic model instead of this wider model of it is also about nutrition, it is also about food safety, it's also about thriving communities. And so how do we finance for that? In the markets, we will often see systems of credit. Lots of women groups doing savings groups there. We even see vendors offering their long-time consumers credit, even in the low-income markets. There are things about vendor fees. There's a form of social protection that exists in markets. We learned that a lot during COVID, that there are these innovative forms of sharing food, making arrangements that provide a form of resilience. It's obviously income, employment, livelihoods, and about knowledge and communication. It is also where governance comes into the market. So the market committee leaders, the food group leaders come into contact daily with different levels of government sometimes. For example, food safety can be at a higher level of government, but then you also have the city regulators in the markets as well. And as to what extent those vendors are part of the decision-making in those processes is a key element. So we see markets as multiple an entry point with multiple levers for change: environment, social health, economic and governance, but then how does that fit into a cost-benefit and sound investment model? So as I've mentioned before, there are different types of markets. Wholesale is often more easily invested in, but it is these mixtures between the large and small retail markets and the hybrid markets that are more difficult to invest in and are seen as very risky. We have seen the growth of specialized markets across the world, so local or organic or farmers markets, but even the farmers markets will fall under the city government mandate, as you know, in some form. Where zoning, where they can set up their market, health regulations, waste regulations. So there's a lot that still comes into the city government mandate, even if they don't own and or manage these markets. Recently, I was at the city of Johannesburg, which is a government wholesale market, but they also link it to a social investment retail market of low-income vendors as well. So bringing these two connection points together has been a way of really reaching more people and being more inclusive as a financial investment model. And there we see the reach. There's 5,000 farmers coming across South Africa, 10,000 buyers every day. We see the normal kind of commission agents. Even in Pakistan, we have the commission agents there. There's always some sort of transaction. There's always some form, even if you think the market is informal. There are these transactions happening. In this case, it's a much more formalized market run by the city of Johannesburg, which includes both the wholesale and then this informal, which I like to say dealing with informality is difficult, because if you walk into a city government market in many of the countries where we work in Asia and Africa, it will look like an informal market. It is full of informal practices and is full of connections with the informal sector. Again, this is the market that we saw at the beginning, following some of the investments. In Tanzania, because of the government structure, we actually had to work with all three levels of government in order to get permissions and engage with the city as well as the market committee leaders to work out how we could redesign their market. How could we move the vendors out? How could we move them back in? Did we have their buy-in? What kind of design? It's not enough to have a technical design where the pitch of your roof is correct, it's got passive cooling, you've got water tanks, and it is actually how does it fit into the daily lives of those vendors, but also how does the flow in terms of food safety, where do you put those fish? Where do you put the live hens? What is the flow of things? Where does the transportation hubs connect to these things? So there's a lot of things that go beyond the technical thinking of maybe just a perfectly designed market in these markets. We do a lot of work also in Pakistan, and these are some of the markets, and you can see the variety of investments. Sometimes just a roof and a concrete floor and a tap is enough to make huge gains. So we often think of huge investments, but sometimes small can be very, very effective and make huge strides. Again, in Pakistan, Rawalpindi is the sister city to Islamabad, the capital, and we can see food markets or food streets are part of the culture. That's what people do every day. And in Rawalpindi, it is very much of a housing, residential area that feeds in to they basically have people that work in Islamabad. So in Rawalpindi, they come home to eat, and it just becomes housing estates. And what they've done is try to capture the value and the cultural value and the economic value of these markets by clustering the street food markets under a sort of highway bridge next to the city, next to the housing communities, so that you don't get these housing deserts, but you keep the value. I'm not going to go into Bogo City too much because we have the mayor from Bogo City who has actually done something very innovative with the street food vendors in a public and private partnership arrangement, clustering them into very loosely structured culinary centers where you can regulate, you can support, they can share, they can be provided with water and electricity without losing the culture or the nature of the food market. This is why markets are such an important investment, because they don't only connect with small growers within the city and within the peri-urban space. They don't only connect with the last mile vendors. They connect across food systems, across borders even. Oranges arriving from Tanzania on the top of a bus. These are people that are very resourceful, they're very connected, but we don't know all these relationships. We haven't got measurements of them, so we can't quantify them in an investment balance sheet, as it were, and yet we can see the viability here. This is some of our investment gain. Got involved actually in building markets, although I think we would prefer to be more on the TA side of it now. Through Cyclone Idai in Beira. It basically hit landfall in Beira and it flattened Beira. at the time. And so we got in and we said immediately, let's put roofs back and build back better with very simple buildings, because we had so much to do there. And you can see the water tanks, the solar panels, the connection with the last mile vendors. We learned lessons like it's not always viable or needed to put in a huge cold room, when actually ice, if you put an ice maker in, well, is obviously mobile. It can go on the back of these bicycles with cooler boxes, but it also goes around different communities. So here are some of the low-cost investments. You can actually see there's basic water on the tap, there's passive cooling through the bricks. Even raised wooden counters is enough to bring in food safety and keep food from perishing. The cold rooms, but very importantly, is involving the market committee as part of the governance, as part of strengthening investments. And also have your facts. I often get told women are the people selling in the markets, but actually all over the world I find it very different. In Kenya, we find women sell fruits and vegetables, men more animal source products. In Pakistan, we find that men, through the family relationships, are usually the ones selling, and actually the women buy from the last mile vendors or go to the very big fruit and vegetable markets. And that is important to understand how you invest in different ways. You can have a look at this paper if you're interested in it, but we actually took some of the data from our long-term investment in a city in Machakos, Kenya, and we had this phased investment. So we started during COVID, and as we saw the governance and people were taking responsibility, taking ownership of various things, making sure the toilets were cleaned, informing the city government if water broke down, we invested. So we invested a total of 300,000, and you can actually see it's on climate smart issues as well. So why are these markets regarded as risky? Are there only philanthropic investments, and how can we make them more financially sustainable and turn markets actually into the resilience hubs that they really are for nutrition? I think I've mentioned all of these points. I'm going to hand over to my colleague from ICLEI Africa.
Thanks, Annie. And I think you've just given us an amazing tour of the spectrum and diversity of markets that we're dealing with and talking about. And I think we're just emphasizing that there's not a homogenous set of investments or spaces we're trying to work in. I think from our perspective coming into this, and I felt it would be helpful to, in very, very broad terms, to do a bit of a broad view on the African system and saying, if we're talking about understanding the scale of investment that we need, there's estimates around 7,500 towns and cities across Africa, the population of which are due to double in the next 25 years. Currently, we've been doing some mapping across a number of small and large cities. And again, please just walk with me on this journey. These are rough estimates. But if we assume that there's say 10 markets for each of those 7,500 or 7,600 towns and cities across the continent today, that takes us to roughly 50,000 markets across Africa currently. We've also then looked at, Annie was talking about a medium to small size upgrade of the market work they've been doing, coming in at around $360,000. And we've been doing some rough financial modeling around market kind of capex costs. And you get these big wholesale markets, $20 million plus investments, but you also get market investments that are, where $20,000, $30,000 can do a huge amount, as Annie was saying. Putting in a concrete floor and a tap makes a massive difference. So if we work on a rough estimate of, 500,000 capex per market, currently that's a $25 billion gap just to upgrade and bring the current markets we have up to a relative standard of hygiene, solid surfacing, drainage, roofs. Then if we then assume we need to build to meet a doubling population in the next 25 years, we need to double those number of markets with new builds. So the estimate that we come to is, and again, here, very, very rough overall costs, around us $86 billion kind of direct capex need for those markets, the majority of which are going to be in small ticket size projects under $500,000. And these are traditionally the investments that have been much harder for the DFIs and the other bigger organizations to invest in because the transaction costs are so high and the risks associated with them are much higher, and where there's much poorer record keeping around financial revenue collection and many other aspects. So I think this to me is just to paint a kind of broad picture around how big the scale of the challenge is and the number of markets. If we're talking really about scaling this, and we're talking really about investing into a kind of transition across these market systems that we need to be thinking about. It's a huge, huge, huge challenge. And while the work that ICLEI and GAIN and others have been doing is I think, leading the way in terms of thinking about small pilots and, a demonstration in, whether it's in Kisumu or in Machakos, or these are a drop in the ocean in terms of the broader picture that we're needing to be working on. When you think about currently 50,000 market upgrades that are probably needed. So the question then is, how do we fund the kind of plurality of the spectrum from these very well-run, organized wholesale markets like Annie has mentioned in Johannesburg, through to the hybrid markets, that have some level of positive revenue flows, through to the very small informal markets that have popped up on dusty street corners and transit nodes that today are markets of 3 or 4 traders, but in 20 years' time are going to be markets of 300 or 400 traders. So I think we need to bring in private investment into this, and we need to bring in national capital. Donor financing can help with the pilots and getting the ball rolling, but ultimately we need to bring in these, which is not new news to anybody. But the question to me then becomes, how much concessional finance do you need to de-risk the ecosystem, and how do you also do that in a way, and I'll touch on this later through the FAO's kind of presentation we'll deliver on their behalf, is how do you make sure that the kind of nutrition and livelihood outcomes for small traders and local businesses are not put at risk through the types of investments you're making and the types of systems you're pushing your markets towards. So if we're pushing markets into these, making too many investments into big wholesale markets, pushing those wholesale markets to the outskirts of cities, that has a direct negative impact on the traders that are currently operating markets in the center of cities and opens up a transition to a more a kind of a food-based ecosystem that is better suited to big supermarket chains and others. And that you start seeing the kind of changes that we've seen in South Africa with the loss of a lot of our informal economy. So, yeah, what do we need to de-risk and unlock? In the work that we've been doing across a number of cities, I think the kind of key points are that for many African local governments, these are murky ecosystems that are somewhere between an investment into a social good, as you would invest in a clinic or a school, but they're also an important revenue stream for many local governments. And it's kind of a strange space where they're getting finance in externally, either from national governments or development partners. They don't really have a very clear overview of the OPEX. They don't know what it's costing them to run their markets. The Department of Waste and Sanitation or Environment will be managing certain parts. Another department in the city will be funding the security costs, and so on and so on. So it's a very murky space. And there hasn't been a single city that we've gone into and tried to do mapping and financial modeling where we've been able to get a clear answer from the city around what the full costs and revenues of their markets are. And I think that's a really big problem when we talk about trying to scale investment into this and bringing investment. I think it's a space we need to de-risk. So just touching briefly on some of the work we've been doing around Remark and trying to build out a blended finance facility to support this space. So we're doing kind of market investment assessments, kind of readiness assessments across a number of cities across the continent in partnership with GAIN and others. Which is trying to say, map out markets, which ones are ready for investment and which ones aren't. So in Dar es Salaam, for example, we mapped 102 markets across that full spectrum, and then looking at factors such as, what's the quantity of food moving through those markets, who owns those markets. And there was quite a big surprise that came out to us in Dar, where we realized that there was actually a lot of privately owned markets in those cities that we hadn't known were there. And I think that's a really positive sign, because it says that with the right management and the right structures and the right blends, these markets are profitable operations. So there's an opportunity for us to be doing those around the municipally run markets better. And then we've been doing a kind of starting to step into the financial modeling with local governments to help them kind of map that out, understand where the needs are and where the revenue sources are, and how you potentially bring those together. Some things are never going to make money, others can. So can you bring those two together to fund the ones that you need to get to kind of come out with an overall market that's nutrition sensitive? Project preparation, design, support, capacity building around those. And finally saying, I think, we're looking next year to launch this blended finance facility, and we're looking to do a kind of $35 million pilot with the first raise on that, which will kind of phase out over the next 5 years. So that's, I suppose, just a little bit of an example of the space and the kind of work that we're trying to do to de-risk that space and bring investment into this market economy that is capable of starting to move towards, that 50,000 target of markets we need to work in across the continent, even if we start with 50. So that's a little bit of a perspective on the work from ICLEI. So, conscious of time, I'm just moving through this, but coming then through to the work that the FAO was going to present today, but they were unfortunately not able to. They're asking this question of, if we are trying to bring an increasing investment into this, whether it's into wholesale or retail markets, how do we do this in a way, and how do we support financing institutions to do this in a way that is more nutrition sensitive, and that we're not losing the value that these current markets bring, and how do we help small banks to invest in not only into markets but also into small food-based enterprises? And they're developing a toolkit for doing this, with the goal of driving, the adoption of more nutrition-focused approaches to investment into the kind of food economy. They're specifically focusing on Africa at the moment, but I think the tools that they're wanting to develop will be more broadly applicable. So this has two parts. So the first is, I'm just going to move. The first was around developing a bit of essentially toolkit for micro investment into these enterprises. So I think with this, it's really about helping them to find the right businesses. So saying, is your business selling highly processed food? Is your business selling, food that's imported from long distances? Or are you selling, whole foods and fresh foods? So they're wanting to do simple indicators and metrics around this. Thinking then about how they, follow and track this impact, and how you also, as a kind of financing institutions higher up in the value chain, maybe, who are supporting local banks, help to include incentives into those investments to try and, to push that system away from what we're currently seeing as we all know around the dietary transition towards more highly processed foods. And I think we also need to emphasize here that even in the micro-enterprise economy, the small business and informal economy, that very often there actually currently is a big shift towards more highly processed foods. And it's not to say that if you're a small business, you're selling healthy foods necessarily. So they're doing some work, again, with partners in Kenya and using Kisumu as an example of this, around what this could look like for investments into wholesale markets, and identifying, market governance as a key entry point here, and think about what the infrastructures that are needed to get this right look like around cold storage facilities, and what some of the food safety gaps are, and how we develop not only the infrastructures but also the guidelines to do food safety better. Okay, and I think I am short on time, so I'll just skip through that one more. Just to say that they are developing a kind of set of implementation guidelines, and we'll be running a series of courses and capacity building processes around this. And if you want to get in touch with them around that, and an email address up on the screen. And yeah, they'll be piloting this in Kisumu now, and hoping to scale that out going forwards. Hope I did their presentation justice.
I think actually this is the last slide, is that FAO and GAIN are about to finish a course which, if any city government practitioners are interested in doing it, or market officials or academia, which is basically learning about governance, markets and investment. So that will be part of the e-Academy course early in the new year. Thanks. And over to World Bank.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm really glad that you set the stage properly here when talking about investments and financial needs, and really the monetary aspects of this, because of course this is what the World Bank does, is to finance. And I know that all of you have heard of the World Bank, obviously, so I just want to make this really short. But what we do essentially is finance development investments in the public and the private sectors. We mainly invest in low and middle income countries, and especially in contexts where it's difficult for countries to access finance from the regular markets at affordable affordable rates. The World Bank also invests in global public goods, such as climate, and then, of course, in knowledge. I'm sure all of you are aware. So in terms of like strengthening urban food systems and markets, these are key, of course, to reaching some of the objectives that the World Bank has committed to, and such as on poverty, incomes, food security, nutrition, health, climate, environment, and also disaster risk management, etc. I've recently learned that after roads, when it comes to urban development projects, apparently markets is like the most popular investments, really. So it's something that we do a lot under certain projects. However, World Bank investments projects are generally really large. They might be ranging from about $50 million to several $100 million. So the investment in a food market would only be one activity under a larger project. So even like in certain urban development projects, for example, that we finance, they may finance multiple cities under the same investment project. So the World Bank Group provides many forms of different forms of financing. I'm going to give this to you, Anne, because I'm not going to change the slide for a while. I have too many things in my hands. So including then in like we provide different types of financing for food systems and urban food systems, and including towards market development and fresh market developments. And these are largely being determined by whether the investment is in a public good or in a private good. And also, of course, if there is a market failure where actually there is a private good, but you're not really accessing finance from markets, or also obviously who the client or the end target group is, really. So I want to emphasize that the World Bank only finances projects for governments. We sometimes hear the term like World Bank projects, but no, it's World Bank finance projects. The governments or like subnational governments own the projects themselves, and so the requests are coming from the countries for these. So the most common form is really the investment operations. These are specific investments that can be at national or subnational level towards like the governments, and it depends really on the country. So it can finance cities directly, but it really depends on the country structure more than anything else. And these are how a lot of markets are invested in or like are financed. So for example, in Rwanda, where I used to live until just recently, we had multiple projects, both in the agriculture sector and in the urban development sector, that financed fresh markets, but through the national government, but in local context. Under these projects, we also often like offer credit lines or like finance credit lines to private financial institutions. And these don't have to be big banks. They can also be microfinance institutions and also cooperatives and so on. And essentially what happens is that part of this investment project goes directly to a private financial institution for on-lending to small-scale entities or medium-sized companies or market vendors or agriculture producers, often those that don't have access to either affordable finance or where the projects are too risky to really like be financed by regular markets. So you end up with these. Other types of projects also include a community-driven development component, CDD, or also small grants programs. And these also have like big opportunities to finance what you were talking about with these small-scale markets. So I worked for many years on a project in Burundi that had a CDD component that financed multiple local markets, municipal level markets, by the communities then determining that as a socioeconomic infrastructure investment, one of the things they wanted to invest in was like these kind of mixed markets. Whereas also the small grants component then could provide financing for agriculture producers or also logistics provider, bakers, I know we financed a couple and so on. So different forms. Again, they all go via the government, but then you have different forms of how these are financed. In terms of private sector investments, we of course have the International Finance Corporation that finance directly to the private sector. Admittedly, I tried to find investments in fresh markets and could not find it. And I think like a lot of the perception is that the markets are sort of a public goods. They do finance more in supermarkets, and I've seen like feasibility studies being financed by them, but not direct investments. So it's an interesting aspect to like find this business case. Regardless of the sort of financing that is provided, they have to adhere to social and environmental standards, and there has to be positive economic financial returns on the investment. It doesn't mean that you have to have like, strong positive revenues, but you do have to have like positive impacts on jobs or poverty, etc., like economic impacts. We also advocate, obviously, for clear, it's a lesson learned from the past, clear management and ownership so that these markets are properly managed and well-sustained and don't deteriorate after a few years. Okay, so now I need to change the slide. And just quickly, just to say that, again, we do tend to see markets as part of like a holistic food system. So these are the other components that we would finance in order to like kind of make these markets viable, safe, and having like good food coming into them. And then the last slide is to just say that a lot of this presentation is based on a white paper that will be published later this year on urban food systems and World Bank financing, World Bank investments into these. And I also wanted to invite you all to join. So I co-chair the World Bank CGIAR Community of Practice on Urban Food Systems, and we decided to open it up. So I really would like to invite all of you to join. So please send me an email, and I'll put you on the invitation list. And also, if you have any questions or just like to chat, please send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we have the landscape in that you either invest through the city government in whatever means, if it's a national sign-off, and you can amplify by investing one market, many thousands of customers and vendors, including in the value chain, going all the way back to your farmers, or you can decide to invest in individuals. And these are the trade-offs that we have. I think Gail and ICLEI kind of well, invest in a market and you're investing in hundreds of thousands of people, but there's still the case to be made of those people in the value chain that are connected, all the small businesses, but it's how to access it. And often the city governments are struggling to be compliant or investor attractive for this kind of investment, and that's one of the challenges. But that also brings me to our panel. So we have a voice from the cities, but also a voice from Healthbridge in Vietnam, who work in the market space and in governance. And each of them are going to bring a different perspective and some of the success stories of what can be done, but also some of those challenges. So with us today from the city of Kisumu is John Sunday. We also have the city of Bogor, represented by Mayor Rashim. I was wondering whether we have the city of Liege here at all. Okay, and then we also have from Healthbridge. Healthbridge is actually a global NGO, obviously investing in health. They do a lot of work with markets and a lot of advocacy. And in this case, we have the representative from Vietnam, Ha Tran. So at the moment, we're going to hand over, I think, to Luke, because you're going to ask some questions to John.
Hi, John. Nice to have you here.
Hi, Luke. I'm happy to be here too.
So, John, I mean, you've been involved in the Kisumu market system for quite a long time, and kind of directly working with it on a day-to-day basis. And I think Kisumu has been, in some ways, the beneficiary of a number of investments into its markets, some of which I think have had an amazing impact, and others which I think are symptomatic of a wider system where you see big investments with some white elephant markets like sitting, not doing as much as they could be. Not talking about Kisumu specifically, but big investments in cold storage facilities that are now being used as office spaces or storage rooms, But then the others that have had huge impact. From your perspective in Kisumu, that's seen, I think, a range of the spectrum. What are some of your views on the successes and failures, and what determines a success or failure when we're thinking about these investments?
Thank you, Luke. Let me begin by repeating my name. My name is John Sunday. I come from Kenya. I work for the county government of Kisumu, based at the city of Kisumu. Maybe quickly for our audience to understand, Kisumu city is a city within the county of Kisumu. We recently, in 2010, changed our constitution, and now we have 47 county governments, and we have urban units within these county governments. Kisumu is one of them, and these are service delivery units within the counties. Markets are one of the functions that are devolved to the city, and markets are key infrastructure in the urban food system in most cities, Kisumu included, and they play a very important role as centers of access to fresh produce, particularly for the local people. This is where mostly they access their day-to-day food. These are centers of business. These are centers for social interaction. These are centers where a lot of exchange in terms of goods and services occur. So they are very critical within the city itself in terms of food, in terms of social interaction, in terms of growth and development. Kisumu has very many markets, and markets primarily are run by very many departments too, and that is one of the challenges that I'll speak to. We have a department for trade and markets that is responsible for development and upgrading market infrastructure. We have the revenue department, which is responsible for collecting market levies within the markets. We have the Department of Environment that is responsible for collecting waste within the markets. And we have the Social Services Department. So you find that there is a multiplicity of departments involved, and that is part of the challenge that we have in markets. In terms of market infrastructure, in the recent past, markets have become a focus of attention for Kisumu City. We have seen quite a number of upgrades, including overhaul of markets. Kibuye Market, for example, is a beneficiary of World Bank funding under the Kenya Urban Support Program. And it used to be a large informal open-air market. Now we have good structures where the traders are able to do their business for longer hours because there's electricity, there are good paths for walking around. There are sanitary facilities sufficient for the traders because it's a large market that probably houses about 3,000 to 4,000 traders. Initially, those facilities were very limiting, so the market was in a very bad shape. We have the Uhuru Business Market, which is a new market, constructed again afresh by the support of government funding, national government. We have a market in the peri-urban called Otonglo Market. Again, this is an overhaul of a very informal small market, but there was demand for rehabilitation of the market to make it more vibrant. It was done with the support of AFD, the French Development Agency. Currently, we have another market called Kisian, again peri-urban, along the highway to Busia towards the border of Uganda, but within Kisumu City. It's being again funded under the national government. And some other markets that are being funded, construction being funded by the county government itself from within the budget under the Department of Trade and Markets. Alongside that, there have been focused interventions within other markets. The recent one, which is a model market that we're coming up with, was an informal market that largely supports women livelihood. It's called Obunga Mbuta Market. It's a very interesting market that deals in fish byproducts. These are byproducts that come from the fish processing industries. And the byproducts that come from that, from those industries, are processed and prepared to provide food for low-income communities within Obunga Market, which is a market within one of the informal settlements. It has about 200 traders. Majority, about 2/3 of them are women who are making a livelihood out of those processes. And this market recently benefited from a a lot of support through the Afri-Food Links. There is a cold room that was constructed, which is now functional.
John, I'm going to have to keep you on time a little bit.
Yeah.
Can I bring you back to the to the question, which was really around just in kind of 1 or 2 points, like what for you were the elements that have kind of determined this, kind of stepping back from the detail of the markets at an overall level, in your view, have kind of determined whether an investment has worked out in the long term or hasn't?
I think most of the infrastructure improvement in these markets are fairly targeted, and they arise from need from the market stakeholders. We have a market management structure that involves the traders, the county government, and some of the professional groups like the business community. So within the management system that we have, they identify the priority areas of need before we develop a plan for either upgrade or rehabilitation, so that we are addressing the actual needs coming from the market community. So that makes it, they take ownership for what is being done in the market, and once you're able to make those upgrades, they become very beneficial to them. So regular meetings among these stakeholders is a way of reviewing and monitoring whatever investments have been put in place. And what I must express is by that kind of a system, you find that the traders are very keen on protecting the investments that are put in the market. The challenge, however, that we've had there is the across-department kind of roles within the market. So sometimes you find that the county government or the city doesn't provide adequate funding for regular operations and maintenance of this facility. So with time, then we find them degenerating. So that's one of the negatives that we have found there. So the other thing is effective policy that can help in terms of clearly demarcating the roles of these various different stakeholders. So a lot of times you find that politics is able to permeate market management, because the traders then they tend to have a lot more power, so to speak, in terms of overall running of the market. And that also sometimes has a negative impact on the investment we have in the market.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna have to kind of keep it a bit shorter but I think the kind of key points there around governance structures, really understanding how well they're functioning, and bringing in this point that you were making around the kind of consultation and the co-design of the needs and where the investment goes.
I think maybe before I end, there's also the other aspect of information and data capture. It's been fairly informal, and that is very important in terms of planning. So we have a very weak system for data capture that can inform continuous development of the market. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I want to hand back to Annie.
Thank you very much. I also found it very interesting to see how many different people are funding different markets in your area, and maybe there's connecting the dots is one of those lessons that we've learned as well. So next we go to a totally different geography, to Indonesia, to Mayor Rashim. There is a mic there. Thank you very much for joining us. So you have actually been an advocate of street food vendors, in fact as deputy mayor and now as mayor. And normally these are people that are seen as an inconvenience in a city because of congestion, it's difficult to manage, health and hygiene are issues. And yet in Bogor City, they are part of the cultural heart of the food. They often have a digital and a physical place. They're part of the tourism, and these are part of the food that people eat every single day. And as deputy mayor, you were really a champion of actually getting public and private partnership investment to establish 13 culinary centers, which are essentially markets that bring these street food vendors together across your city. Can you tell us a bit about how that was structured? How much did it cost, and how did you get the buy-in from the street food vendors to come across? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. In Bogor, we believe that collaboration is the key to sustainable urban food systems. One of our most successful approaches has been creative financing through corporate social responsibility, not only from state budget or government budget, to support our city culinary centers. As you may know, that street food play vital roles in Bogor City because related to cultural and tourism identity in our city. However, many vendors used to operate without the proper facilities or infrastructure. So rather than relying solely on public funding, we invited the private sector to become part of our solution. Through CSR collaboration, companies contribute to the construction and improvement of culinary centers, including semi-permanent building, vendors booth, also sitting areas, signage and public facilities such as toilet and, of course, waste station for that facility in culinary centers. This contribution help us create safer, cleaner, and more attractive space for both vendors and also visitors. In return, we provide corporate and transparent compensation for them. For example, companies are granted the right to display their logos in this area. On supported facility receive priority in promoting their products, and also benefit from public recognition in city publication and media from our government, what you call it, PR communication, public relation. This model ensures mutual benefits where business enhance their brand reputation while supporting community-based economic growth in our city. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much. I know we are limited on time, so what I will just mention is the importance of you leveraging that corporate social responsibility investment, and you've established that. How did you manage to get that buy-in, though, for the vendors who used to like to be on the street and now they're in the culinary center? What was the transition like?
Yeah, of course, from these partnership models has proven to be not only financially sustainable, but also social impactful. Vendors now have a better working condition, and then consumers enjoy improved hygiene and comfort. And of course, companies gain visibility and social responsible contribution to the city's development, not only right now, but also in the future. Moving forward, Bogor City aims to expand this creative financing to include digitalization, also food waste management, and nutrition education program include in this project. So in short, CSR base is not just about funding infrastructure, but it's about building trust and share value and resilience in our urban food system. Yeah. That's all.
Thank you. And I heard you at the Asia Pacific region as well, and how you had actually included the vendors for the first time in the co-design of the 2025-2029 City Regional Action Plan for Food and Nutrition. So you actually have a whole package, not just the financial investment, but the investment in training, the support with regulation, and then including them as actors in this action plan.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. So next on our panel, we have Ha Tran from HealthBridge International. She is based in Vietnam. Ha, can you, from a totally different perspective, we want to look at that relationship between national and city governments and the markets. As an advocate, you were active in forging of Vietnam's new national policy, which provides a mechanism for public funds to be used in developing and improving urban markets. This is a change from the past in Vietnam, where markets could only be funded through private actors. Can you tell us about the value of the new policy for cities and urban food markets in Vietnam?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ha, and as Anne introduced, I'm working for Health Reach, a public health NGO. Our headquarters is based in Ottawa, but I'm working in Vietnam and in Hanoi. I'm managing the Liver Cities program in Vietnam, and the objective of the program is to create a favorable environment for every urban resident to practice healthy behaviors. So that's why we work to improve accessibility to healthy and nutritious food for urban residents. And local food markets is an important component of our program. Thank you for your interesting question, Anne. Before I answer to it, I would like to quickly highlight that when we're talking about traditional food markets, we should recognize the difference between local context in low and middle income countries in comparison to what we see in higher income settings. For example, in farmers markets in higher income cities, provide places where people go for organic and high quality products. It's like a healthy lifestyle choices. But in low and middle income countries, in cities like Vietnam, Congo, and Kisumu, yeah. So food markets are essential to our daily survival because they provide affordable and fresh food for hundreds of thousands of people in urban areas. Many of them are low-income earners who can, and daily wage earners who cannot afford buying a bulk of food. Yeah, they can only buy a small portion every day. And at the same time, local markets also a source of incomes for small vendors, some small farmers, and women traders. However, these values of food markets in Vietnam have been used to be underestimated for many years. The local food markets in urban areas are considered commercial and profit-generating spaces rather than public goods that ensure food access and livelihood. So with that perceptions, the city governments were not allowed to use public funds for improvement or upgrading food markets. The food markets in urban areas can only be upgraded if they have investment project from private sector. Many private companies, they put their focus on profits rather than people or social public profit benefits. So that's why in the decades of 2010s, we saw many markets rebuilt into commercial centers or supermarkets, while the local food markets was moved to basement with poor access and poor ventilations. And meanwhile, many food vendors face higher rental fees, while their customers fewer because of poor accessibility. So many vendors have forced to close their business, or they had to move out to informal street markets, while many urban residents had fewer access to food. So this is very negative effects. In our advocacy work, we try to encourage the government to see food markets differently, and consider them as the public access that not only ensure contribute to local economies, to the health, to community well-being, but also to the environment. So we argued that markets should be treated as parks, playgrounds, or schools. Public access public space is very important for urban life. This led to a major shift in 2024. The government approved a new market management decree, which allowed to use public funds for improvement of urban food markets. This is a significant change because with the public investment, now the markets can be managed as the public infrastructure, and the rise of vendors can be preserved, and the accessibility to healthy and nutritious food can be ensured for every urban resident. After this approval of the new market, we also see some progress, like Hanoi City. The government announced it plans to upgrade 71 markets starting from 2025.
That is an incredible success to be able to change how markets are viewed only as economic. We often have that, including during COVID, when vendors were seen to be earning too much that they couldn't get access to social protection, for example. So how do we balance the public good investment with also that bit of the private sector in terms of returns? In Vietnam now with the new bill, what is the terms? What do the city governments have to do to get that, to spend that money on a market? Do they have to do planning, strategy, a financial plan? Are there any requirements from national government for when they access those funds?
Oh yes, one of the progressive features of the new government policy is that the new decree require every cities and province must develop a market development strategy, and under this new strategy, it is required to set a clear vision and objectives for the city market network, as well as clear plans for building new market or upgrading existing ones. We also set out the government also required to set out clear implementation responsibilities between departments of the government departments, Department of Trade, Health, Environment, and Finance. At present, HealthRich is supporting Hue city government to be the first city in Vietnam to develop such a market development strategy under this new policy. And this process started with mapping. We examine an assessment of the current situation of markets. We examine the infrastructure and the safety and hygiene condition, as well as climate resilience. Based on that assessment, we identify which markets should be upgraded and which area need new markets. And the result from this mapping and assessment, we have to build finance in an investment plan, and how to allocate the budget plan, how to make a co-finance mechanism. I hope that the lessons from Hue can help to develop a kind of guidance for other cities in Vietnam. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I think we can all learn a lot from that, but what's really interesting here is if you didn't have an NGO to come and help the city government or advocate for these things, they wouldn't be happening. Markets would not be on the table today, actually, if it wasn't for various NGOs and some seed funding that we have had from donors. But it is how to make it a sound business case. And as you can see, you're actually assisting the city government to comply. Let's know our markets, let's do the feasibility, the investor readiness. And what I think we're still in an experimental phase is kind of what are the terms of repaying funds, public funds, so how do we manage them? And there we're at the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, and perhaps one of the most interesting things, which I know you're doing in Zambia, is a food desk. having in the city government something as basic as somebody who is the go-to person, the coordinator, the one who sort of says, let's sit down and see where we've got duplication, where we've got synergy, where we can save money instead of spending money. And that is, it seems such a simple thing, but I think it's really critical to coordination. Do you have anything to say on that, Luke, before we...
No, I mean, I think the point around coordination is so critical, not just for markets, but for food more broadly. And we did a basic assessment of South Africa, which came out that, roughly 9% of our GDP was going towards spending on food and ensuring the right to food was met. This is not a figure that is consolidated across departments, but we're spending 9% of our GDP with no coordination mechanism for that spending, which is crazy. And I think the same applies in cities. So I think this thing around food desk coordination mechanisms, and I think also perhaps a kind of market coordinator across market departments is also an interesting idea to explore, and maybe Kisumu is a place to try that. But yeah.
Thank you very much. So I hope thank you to our speakers who've actually given us some of the real granularity as opposed to our high level in positions. I think we would like to open up the floor because we're also interested to hear from you. Kind of, what are you doing? What kind of financial plans have you got together? What is a barrier to development in your city or as an NGO? I don't know if we need to have a mic. Yeah. Thank you. Please just introduce yourself before you speak, and then you can ask.
Thank you. Good morning, all. My name is Purna from Embassy of Indonesia. I'm happy to be here, and thank you very much for very inspiring presentations. I only have one question for representative of World Bank, but also to share also. In terms of innovative financing, I think as a country with the largest Muslim populations of more than probably 260 million people, I think Islamic philanthropy finance would be, I think, a crucial and untapped potentials to be utilized by cities in Indonesia, for instance. So, and it's also guarantees not only the food safety, but the halal systems for Muslim populations in Indonesia, in every city in Indonesia. So my questions to you is there any model that the World Bank is working on or has been developed with the government or cities that we can use and refer to when it comes to implementations in Indonesia? Maybe the mayor of Bogor would like to explore this, if there's this untapped potential. Thank you.
So just to understand exactly the question, you were wondering if there are financial models for, in terms of the halal, for example, I think this is a typical investment in private sector development, so as I mentioned, there are different programs, for example, credit lines or grants programs that often is provided under these types of investment projects, for example, in value chain development. And I assume you do it as a bit of a standard, like other types of standards, which is very common under World Bank finance projects, that they are also providing technical support to the different farmers or processors throughout the value chain for aligning their production to different sort of standards. In terms of the larger projects, they really go via the typical financing. So philanthropy is a bit different. So these are like other big organizations working on it. The World Bank is more working as an actual bank, I would say. I don't know if I understood your question correctly.
No, just a follow-up one thing, if I may. Follow on one, because the potential is almost 20 billion US dollar this year alone for zakat, infaq, sadaqah. This philanthropy, this type of philanthropy, Islamic finance. So is there any model, maybe developed ongoing project with the Middle East countries, which can be used by Indonesia also to implement in our cities in terms of this?
I see, to use this type of philanthropy money, so not as, so admittedly, I think we don't work so much with this as far as I know. I can check, of course, with my colleagues in Washington, but maybe someone else has more experience of working with this type of philanthropy, yes.
I think you also are interested in how one has those routes to access finance. What kind of model from a city allows you to access that? Would you have anything? Because I know ICLEI Africa has been doing some research into this.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the halal component in the Islamic finance, but I think it's a really interesting point, and I think it's a space that we perhaps often overlook, and there's populations in countries like Tanzania that also have large Muslim populations. So I think from my perspective, as we're kind of thinking into building out a blended finance facility, I think I appreciate your comment, and I think it's something that we'll look into, because I think it is often an untapped space. So yeah, thanks for that.
In fact, I think we're looking at that as an exciting space to see, even from a philanthropic, I think there will always be a need for the philanthropic investment, but for the rest of the investments, how do we stack or thread these different investments, these investments that are only in renewable energy or in youth jobs, or in then how do we, or only on farm, like IFAD, to say, well, your food has to go somewhere, it's usually going to some of our markets. So how do we connect those flows in a way that is not only reliant on a donor and not only reliant on the World Bank funding to do that? And what do those terms look like? Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Hello, from the city of Vancouver. And I'm wondering how appropriate this question is, because from the city's perspective, or at least from Vancouver's perspective, you know, we haven't been able to establish a hub. But I'm just wondering about scaling. It sounded like most of the funding that we've talked about, and I came in late, so maybe I didn't hear everything, is, you know, for micro, small, and medium. And I'm just wondering what happens with the scaling. You know, in Vancouver, for example, there was, you know, like the farmers market tried to get a hub together, but one of the arguments that was presented for not funding it was that they were saying that they wanted to expand so that restaurants could start to buy their product at the farmers market undercover and order ahead and really expand the reach of the farmers that were coming in. And you know, the city at the time, I wasn't with the city then, but they said, well, that's really not our focus. It was to scale that next level. And I know a lot of like farmers markets are wonderful places for businesses to start. It's a great place to test new products, to have face-to-face conversations with your customers, to build that brand recognition, or, you know, and that loyalty, and then to take that next step. Is there funding to get them to that next step, to support vendors, to begin to do that kind of business planning so that that scaling can happen? I'm just kind of curious.
I think you bring an interesting point. One is obviously between funding individual vendors as a business to move up from an incubation role to a more thing. And the other idea is, how do we understand scaling and deepening? Because for us, the idea is not to become more, to redefine the value chain, to redefine efficiencies. It's not about having a bigger and bigger and bigger market that then has more diversification in it. It is about having more markets distributed throughout the community. So that's a different kind of scaling to the more industrialized model. We need new types of logistics, new types of thinking. I know that the restaurant model is often a part of markets where they have the market here and then they have a soup kitchen next door, or a food bank, or else a next level form of development, but it depends. I think it's two different models. If you're going to go from a farmer vendor to be more profitable and you want to diversify into a restaurant, you are moving out of the kind of market space in some way, or out of the traditional model. So I don't know if you want to also add to that, and then World Bank.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the spaces that we're seeing where the wholesale markets have a very interesting data set on this point is they have often been selling to the same people or the same families for 20 or 30 years. And they have a very clear understanding of the kind of turnover of those vendors, their reliability, the frequency of their purchasing. And I think wholesale markets are a very interesting entry point potentially for helping to provide those businesses with working capital that they need to provide, that they need in order to grow and expand their businesses. And they're very often cash strapped. So I think they have the data sets to make loans to those businesses that banks don't have. And they have a direct incentive for doing that because it ultimately increases that wholesale markets, it increases their customer base. So that's something we're seeing in Cape Town where they're looking, the wholesale market is explicitly trying to drive a growth in the informal economy. And they're seeing these working capital loans to the kind of retail vendors as an avenue for doing that. It's not necessarily funding what you would maybe think of in a Vancouver context as a, the kind of niche product, organic, farmers market thing. It's much more low-income product into low-income market. But I think the principle is the same.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Otherwise, we are going for coffee shortly, and then you can find any of us, including our city government representatives and the Vietnam colleagues, once again. Thank you. And for the closing, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really so much that's been said.
There's a question here. If
Is it a burning question, or is it something you could check in with us? At coffee. All right.
Yeah.
I just know we have got the kind of room also for a set amount of time. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that's been said, and I think what really stands out for me across all of this is the plurality, both in the kind of scale of markets, from the very small to very large, and the different functions they play. But I think also the plurality in the sense of markets being both an economic space, but also a really, and I love the point around understanding markets as parks and thinking about what that looks like and seeing them as places for social good and civic spaces. And I think we need to really be thinking across the spectrum of that. I think back to C40, the launch of their report yesterday and the presentation around this notion that there really are no silver bullets to this. There's not a single thing we're going to come in and do to kind of match the scale of this. And I think what we're all advocating for here is a plurality of investment and a kind of pluralistic approach into this space. And I think, thinking about Kisumu, the need to understand the kind of consultation and governance processes that ensure that the investments we make are contextually specific, contextually sensitive in how we're doing that. And with that, we can hopefully kind of scale and deepen this work. So yeah, I think thank you very, very much to our panelists for the kind of time and the long travels you've taken to be here. It's really, really appreciated. And to all of you for your time. Thank you very much.